Thank you very much. I will be presenting I will be presenting an analysis of policy reliance on entrepreneurship. The paper or the presentation here with the time given covers these aspects, intro, research problem, up until a conclusion. And I will get started very briefly. So one of the interests of this paper or the motivations behind one of the motivations for this paper is to really look into policy reliance on entrepreneurship as something that, is an argument for why governments such as the South African government is adopting or is positive about what entrepreneurship can achieve. But what this paper also does, it carefully looks into, whether this a sort of motivation by the state to promote entrepreneurship through policy is not just another way to responsibilize individuals who otherwise are battling infrastructure and other challenges. This paper does not look down at the fact that, entrepreneurship has been a reason for success for some, but it rather looks at the state's motivation or a government's motivation for suddenly or for riding the wave of entrepreneurship. Now, I use a documentary analysis approach to look at the National Development Plan 2030 and the National Youth Policy, which are policy documents. The one spans between 2015 and 2030, that's the National Youth Policy, and the National Development Plan was inaugurated in 2009 and officiated in 2010 and has been since adopted then to be a roadmap for South Africa's developmental priorities. What is most appealing in this paper is that, if related or compared to other African states, it also provides a further explanation or a comparable explanation why African states also promote entrepreneurship in different forums. Now, there are 4 sections on this. Of course, I've dealt with the first one. The second one is then looking at what then the state says, for example, on the National Youth Policy about youth livelihoods, their struggles, and the lack of employment. The third section looks at then the promotions of entrepreneurship in policy, the tone and how policy is using entrepreneurship, whether as a way of escaping the demands of the public or as a way of curbing, potential revolutions that may come from disgruntled youth that is not finding opportunities in an economy. Last but not least, I look more specifically then to the South African context, where I situate the discussion of this paper in the role of a Department of Higher Education. Of course, in the interest of time, then I will start moving very quick. Now, what is the objective of this study? The study analyzes and explicates policy position on youth entrepreneurship, looking at the South African policy context and the National Development Plan and the National Youth Development Policy as part of policy documents that are analyzed here. The main question is, what are the policy inferences on youth entrepreneurship based on its policy contents and statements? The literature review or the literature that I'm building on is literature that focuses on the theory of structure and agency, where structure is defined as that which determines the agential class position. So the role of the student, in case where mainly youth, in this case, I'm focusing on students, the precarity that comes with entrepreneurship. So either by way of calling it self-employment or entrepreneurialism, and the outcome of self-organization. And then agency, I look at it from 2 views, which is individual agency and as well as political agency. Now, individual agency, these are specific powers that individuals have and they can exercise on their own, where entrepreneurship is exercised by individuals looking at their own capabilities and abilities. But on the other hand, political agency is practiced or exercised by things, in this case, a political system that then uses its own structure, that is government, to promote whatever objective it has or to practice whatever form of agency it seeks to practice. Now, the challenge in literature is that, entrepreneurship has adopted a more positive approach, or research in entrepreneurship and entrepreneurship education in particular, and in the context of South African literature, has since focused on entrepreneurship as the good thing, as the thing that will save many from, the failures of the state. But that is showing that then literature itself remains sparse in appreciating that in any, of these, there is structure and agency that must be looked at. And structure or agency that is required in entrepreneurship literature, there is agency that is required in entrepreneurship literature to deal with how structure is used to promote entrepreneurship. Within structure, there lies power, there lies ideas, and whose ideas are mainly adopted and whose ideas are not or are suppressed. Now, one can argue that youth sometimes comes with different forms of entrepreneurialism or entrepreneurial projects, but the state has a different idea as well. Now, within structure and power, that's where you find these tensions where the youth policies that would have otherwise been crafted by the state would promote states' ideas of entrepreneurship. And at some point, I will make an example of what I mean by that. But then the state on the main, and that's the argument in literature that has not enjoyed attention, which this paper seeks to highlight, that is the government's failure to provide the basics, provide infrastructure, economic opportunities, and state investment, but also attempting to resolve those things that block investment, for example, such as corruption, which has been reported widely in literature and other reports. So it can be the fault, or the main issue is that when a state suddenly uses entrepreneurship to argue development or youth opportunities, it tends to fall in the trap of responsibilizing young people, or to say young people are failing because of their own doing, when it's not always the case. Now, I'll go on the methods briefly on how then I went about conducting or doing this analysis of policy. The analysis itself is qualitative, and I use an educational research approach as my research interests are focusing on youth who are students and how policy has located those students. Of course, by the complexity of the word or the term youth in the South African context, I've opened my analysis to what the policies or the policy inferences that are made about youth who are not in education, not in employment, and not in training. Now, this research builds on very interesting cases that were done by Bartlett and Vavras, Hanneman and De Jager. De Jager did this work in Tanzania. Hanneman did it in Rwanda. Bartlett and Vavras also did the same work in Tanzania. But they were mainly, Bartlett and Vavras mainly focused on how do you analyze, these kinds of policy ideas. So Hanneman rather demonstrates that qualitative research enables or allows researchers to explore new areas of research where we look a bit further than the surface when we talk, for example, in this case, about entrepreneurship. So then the documentary analysis focused on major documents, which is the National Development Plan, as I've introduced these, and then the National Youth Policy document, as I've also introduced these. So I worked with excerpts that were drawn from these documents, and I analyzed them on NVivo alongside various sets of data. But the interview data I'm not referring to on this paper. I'm only referring specifically on, what the policy infers or discusses or deals with in the document. Now, there are promotions of entrepreneurship that I have picked out from, these documents to say, what is it that the policy documents are arguing or are saying should be reasons for promoting entrepreneurship. And then we put these in a test in terms of whether or not these are justifiable or whether they are simply responsibilizing the youth. My findings are quite expansive, but I mean, I don't have the time to go on into all of them, or by way of elaboration, given that I have the amount of time mentioned to present. Now, let's look at first the National Development Plan. It promotes entrepreneurship because the assumption is that entrepreneurship can address economic transformation. So those who were previously excluded from the economy can be included. Youth livelihoods, those young people who are unable to transition from being dependents on their parents can then, transition to becoming young, independent adults. But also the assumption of the NDP is that then the role of higher education and training should be about entrepreneurship. So those are just high-level findings of what then, when you draw out excerpts, and then these are themes that emerge. But more specifically, Chapter 9 of the NDP sets out that, universities should train citizens with highest level skills for employment needs of the public and private sectors, and to produce knowledge and provide social mobility. The challenge with the NDP on this part is that it's never clear about what do you mean then about all these, different motivations. And that creates ambiguity for state planning and for how then these policies cascade down to universities. But then what we have seen cascading down are the so-called programs to support young entrepreneurs. Now, these programs have since focused on things like funding and finance, mentoring and incubations. As I said earlier, that I'll make an example. Now, when the state does whatever, or the policies are not clear on these, what do you do in an instance where a young entrepreneur is actually a content creator with unique needs of producing content and selling it on YouTube? The policies in that context, they fail to appreciate or bring or allow funding and finance to some of these diverse and unique and different forms of enterprising ideas. And that is where this paper, I think, critiques, the approach of policy when it comes to entrepreneurship. It does not appreciate the unconventional forms of entrepreneurship, yet, there is an assumption that young people must do entrepreneurship to save themselves. Now, the policy again frames collaborations to promote entrepreneurship amongst entrepreneurs and the government. But much of this again goes on to saying the collaboration efforts are only there to promote entrepreneurship, but in reality, there's still very little that policies are tracking themselves to, or the policymakers are tracking themselves to. But that's a high level, excerpts. Let's look into some of the issues that may require discussion. Yes?
You're on injury time, but yeah, I'll give you 1 minute to summarize.
Okay, I mean, I can go then to my conclusion so that I don't affect the program further. What then can we look at when we're thinking of analyzing policies for states, with policies that are promoting entrepreneurship? I think it's the question of push and pull factors to say what is really the motivation of a state to promote entrepreneurship and what could pull the other parties into such. But at times, as I say, structure and agency requires that we look into the power relations that exist between the two, because state is by far still powerful, and states must be very careful of the kinds of assertions or inferences that they put on unsuspecting young people, where the state might start using entrepreneurship as a nice wave to ride, to advance, whether getting more votes in the future, and etc. Thank you. I will stop at that.